Well, hello and welcome. You're watching The Week Ahead with myself, Liesl Wilson. We're going to take a look at some of the stories for the week ahead. You can interact with us on our various social media platforms using the hashtag The Week Ahead or at The Week Ahead. I'm Liesl Wilson. Let's take a look at some of those top stories we can expect today. Our first up this week will mark a year since the July unrest of 2021 in KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng. Motorists will again have to fork out more at the fuel pumps. And the Office of the Public Protector assures South Africans that the probe into Palapala farm saga is on track. So those will look at some of your headlines. Let's get into your top story now, where we've seen another hike in fuel prices is going to be looming. South Africans are feeling the pressure. The rising fuel prices have a ripple effects on consumers and businesses alike, reducing disposable income and increasing business input costs. Fuel prices have been on an upward trajectory. This comes as oil prices went up due to international supply disruptions linked to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It also comes at a time when South Africa marks 1 year since the July unrest and its effects on the economy and democracy at large. For more, we are joined by Chief Economist Dr. Azar Jammine. A very good afternoon to you, Dr. Azar. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon, Lisa, and to your viewers.
Dr. Azar, seems to be quite a number of talking points that we're going to get through in this interview. So I think I want to just start off with the imminent or the looming fuel price hike that's set to happen this week. Perhaps you could take us through some of the macro and micro factors as we head into this petrol hike.
The most important macro reason for the hike in the petrol price is that international crude oil prices have risen very steeply over the past 9 months. The average price of oil last year was $70 a barrel, and currently the price of oil is around $112, $114 a barrel. That's an increase of around 70-80% in the price of oil. Simultaneously, the rand has depreciated a little against the dollar, from around 14 rand to 16 rand to the dollar. And the combination of that means that we are paying almost double in rand terms for the oil that we import. And under those circumstances, the authorities have very little option but to pass that on to consumers. There are potential ways in which they could mitigate the impact, and that is, as they've already done in part, by reducing or completely eliminating the fuel levy. But then they will have to find the money from other sources in order to pay for that. And the impact on consumers is material. The inflation rate itself is set to rise to around 7.5% next month. And under the circumstances, people who spend quite a lot of their disposable income on traveling are going to have less money available to spend on everything else. And the main reason for the rise in fuel prices, well, there really are two. Firstly, the world has been trying to work towards a clean energy syndrome over the last few years, and trying to act against any plans to embark upon more fossil fuel projects, be it oil, gas, or coal. And as a result, there's been relatively little investment going into producing more coal and oil and gas. And the result is that, and yet the world hasn't really made a big switch into renewable energy and electric ways of doing things. And as a result, there is now a shortage of crude oil and natural gas and coal, and their prices have shot up. What has exacerbated the situation, obviously, was the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the sanctions imposed on Russia, and especially on Russian oil, which has created an even bigger shortage of the mineral than was previously the case. And South African consumers, as is the case with consumers all around the world, are now having to bear the brunt of that.
Absolutely. As we continue to monitor the effects of the food and fuel, surge in prices, perhaps also its impact on consumers and businesses. I also want to look at this week, where again it marks almost a year since the unrest occurred. The country is still reeling from its effects as we begin to soldier on. And the tasks that lie ahead, overcoming them. I mean, we obviously have to look at this in the context of South Africa, perhaps how inequality was constructed historically. I wonder how you could speak to that as we look at, what unfolded a year ago.
Oh, yes. Rising inequality has obviously been a big syndrome of South Africa for for decades, beginning with apartheid, obviously. But then even after the apartheid regime was replaced by the ANC, what was embarked upon was a massive change in the educational system. And unfortunately, the results have not been particularly successful. What we see is that only a very small portion of the population get a very good education. And I must say it's a world class at our private schools and our Model C schools. But 80% of students who go to school receive a very poor level of education. So when they come out of school, they are ill-equipped to add value to the economy and therefore to stand a decent job down through which they can add value and earn a decent income. And the result has been a very big increase in inequality between those who are fortunate enough to get a decent education and to follow those careers that are in high levels of demand, and the majority of young South Africans who have been left stranded by not receiving a decent education and not being able to command, to basically contribute in a way that makes them employable. And of course, this built up to a crescendo and continues basically even to the present. And obviously was one of the contributory factors to the social unrest that we had last year. What has exacerbated the situation is that the high levels of inequality have been exploited by politicians in many ways, and you had a certain faction claiming that it was standing to help the downtrodden individuals, but in the process really only and was basically in command of the economy for a better part of 9 years, and basically all that it did was benefit those who were in power rather than the majority of people. Nonetheless, this led to the incarceration of Jacob Zuma, ostensibly for opposing the findings of the courts, but essentially because he had presided over the whole process of state capture that impoverished the country and exacerbated the levels of inequality still further. In this regard, one can only point to the impact of empowerment policies that have differentiated between certain people who've been fortunate enough to benefit from those empowerment policies and the vast majority who have been left stranded. And all this came to a head in July last year, exacerbated by the incarceration of Jacob Zuma, which was used as an excuse by certain people to basically try and wreck the economy.
Dr. Zar, based on that context, I also want to look at the road ahead then. I mean, when we look at the gaps, perhaps even the links between urban and rural areas for capital accumulation in South Africa, and perhaps the need for diversification of production in South Africa, this definitely became abundantly clear during the protests. How do we begin to achieve this? How do we also explore alternatives in creating equitable industrial opportunities for the future labor force?
You're absolutely correct. And of course, one of the big sources of inequality, the spatial inequality, is the fact that due to our apartheid history, you have so many people living far from their place of work and having to travel large distances to get to work, etc., that involves transport costs that exacerbate the crunch on non-transport disposable income. Essentially, we have to try and restructure the educational system to try and promote people to do more mathematics, to start gearing themselves up for the so-called fourth industrial revolution, so that they have a bigger role to play in actually driving economic activity. That's not been the case at the moment. A relatively small handful of people are driving this economy. And the only way that you can actually spread and diversify your economy is by educating people in different areas and training them appropriately to take up those positions. And that's a huge project. And I don't think the authorities have appreciated it sufficiently, and nor the educational authorities. And that's, I think, at the heart of where it begins, to get people more productive. It does also involve having to change the value system of many of the youth in the country who believe that everything, that they're entitled to everything, without appreciating that in order to actually get on in an economy and start contributing, you've got to do a lot of hard work in the process, firstly educationally, and then when you get into your job, to actually work very hard at it. Unfortunately, there has been a development of a feeling of instant gratification and instant enrichment. In my view, exacerbated by the growth of casinos and lottos and that kind of thing, to make people think that the path to riches is through, being lucky enough to be at the right place at the right time. And yes, that may help a few, but in the broader scheme of things, the only way to really get along is through hard work and productivity and value creation.
Dr. Azar, thank you very much for those sentiments. Dr. Azar Jamin, Chief Economist, chatting to us about some of the economic matters that we can look forward to in the week ahead. Again, there's an imminent fuel hike that's set to come about this week, and also looking at the impact that the July unrest has had on the country, its economy and the democracy at large. This as we reflect 1 year on that tragedy. Again, in other news now, moving on to NERSA in Gauteng has just briefed the media on its program of action of non-payment of nurses for 3 months now. Young nurses doing mandatory 1 year of community service under the employment of Gauteng Department of Health continue to suffer indignity and prejudice meted against them by the department, which has not paid their salaries for more than 3 months now. Now, this comes despite having several engagements with the department and bringing the matter to the attention of the Premier of the province, David Makura. Perhaps for more, let's bring in our reporter, Mbalenhle Mtetwa. A very good afternoon to you, Mbalenhle. Thank you for joining us. Perhaps you could just quickly give us a brief unpacking of what came out of that briefing.
Good afternoon, Diesel. You're absolutely right. There is a plan of action that the union will be undergoing within the next couple of weeks. And this is in the interest of bringing attention to what has been happening and the experiences of nurses in Gauteng. I'm joined by one of the regional chairpeople, the Gauteng chairperson, who's going to talk to us and give us more detail as to what exactly the plan of action is going to entail. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate your presence.
The plan of action, talk to us about that.
Well, tomorrow in the afternoon, we'll issue a statement that will highlight our program of action. Our plan is to visit the Premier of the office of this province, David Makura. It's also to visit Gauteng Treasury, also to visit the Gauteng Department of Health. We think that these three people that we've highlighted, the Premier being the head of government in this province, we, after having engaged him and brought the matter to his attention, we are not happy with where we are as things stands currently. Also, Treasury, these neoliberal policies, these austerity measures that we are seeing being implemented are not bringing a positive impact in health, because as things stand, there's about 4 billion that was cut from the compensation of employees' budget in the Department of Health. So we think that Treasury must come to the party. This is equally their problem. So we'll be going to all of them, highlighting these challenges that we are having. it can be correct that young black people who have just joined the profession are being given a bitter taste, in the profession by not being paid their salaries for over 3 months. We can't celebrate that, even though the department called us into a meeting last night where they promised that by Thursday all these nurses would be paid. We cannot applaud that because in the first instance we're not supposed to be dealing with such a problem. So we are calling on South Africans, Gauteng citizens, to support nurses in this province because nurses have proven beyond reasonable doubt that they are central to the mandate of the Department of Health and also for caring for citizens. So we cannot allow a situation where nurses are exploited and worse by a government that is democratically elected. So we cannot allow that situation.
And how many nurses have been affected at this stage by this non-payment?
Well, those who have completed their community service is 810, but we're informed that as of the 30th of June, as we had agreed on the 7th of June, that they must be paid. Some have received their payments on the 30th. Currently, we're collecting data, and currently what we have is about 70 of them who have not received their salaries. There are those also 727 who are doing their community service currently who have also not gotten paid. So we are collecting the data, but what we know is that if you combine the two numbers, it's over 1,000 that nurses are facing this challenge. Yesterday, I was also contacted by nurses in the West Rand region. There's about 20 of them who, as of the 30th of June 2022, remain unemployed, who have been retrenched by the department. So these are some of the things that we have brought to the attention of the department. And yesterday, we were able to get a commitment to say, we must attend to that 20. We cannot allow a situation where we're retrenching nurses in a province that clearly needs nurses while we're still having staff shortages.
Now, before we went on air, you were talking about how these nurses are actually stuck between a rock and a hard place because after having received funding to go to school, they then have to do this mandatory community service, and if they don't, they then have to, pay back the money. Talk to us about all of these details.
Well, the contract the bursary contract that these students are given when they go to school, including myself, which I got, was that for every year the Department of Health funds for your studies, you work back a year, meaning that at the end of the 4 years, you are mandated to work for the Department of Health. You cannot be released. So while you do your community service in these 4 years, you are also working back the number of years that you were funded by the department. If you then, after completing community service, you want to leave the employment of the Department of Health, you are then penalized in that you are made to pay the department some monies back. We have seen many nurses who have fallen victim of this. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that the nurses we're talking about were funded using taxpayers' money by the Gauteng Department of Health. At the end of the day, when they want to stick to what the contract is saying, work for the department, service the people of South Africa, they are then told that they cannot be employed. So these are some of the unfortunate situations.
I'm so sorry. We're about to run out of time, and I have to ask you this question. There are other unions, unions that represent nurses that have done the same thing that you're planning to do, to go and hand over a memorandum of demand. How is this different? Because it seems as though the other unions haven't really gotten any joy from the various departments or gotten feedback. What are you hoping to come out of this?
Well, the difference between us and them is the fact that these things that we're putting on the table, we have got sufficient evidence that what we're demanding is realistic, and through our engagements we have got evidence that actually all we need is a will from government to do this thing. So that is why part of our approach is to invite also those unions to work with us so that we apply pressure. But the other difference is that we will also be approaching court to get a court order to enforce the government to do what it's supposed to do. So that's the difference, that we're not looking at one avenue, but also we have characterized the problem correctly. Those unions were going to the Department of Health only. We are also will be attending to Treasury, which we think that holds the keys to us solving this problem.
Okay. There you have it, one of the union representatives speaking to us about their plan of action and intentions to take the Department of Health to court, forcing them to honor contracts that have been signed by some of these student nurses. It's back to you in studio.
Thank you very much, Mbalenhle Mthethwa. Again, just giving us the latest there. Denosa and Gauteng briefing the media on that program of action on non-payment of nurses for 3 months now. Reporter Mbalenhle Mthethwa just giving us the latest there. Again, looking at some of the issues they've faced against, including the department not having paid these salaries for more than 3 months now. It comes despite several engagements with the department. Again, the latest emerging there from our reporter. Let's leave it there, take a quick ad break and continue with more news on the other side. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You are watching The Week Ahead with myself, Liesl Wilson. In other news now, the East London community is mourning the tragic death of 21 teenagers at Enyobeni Tavern, which occurred last Sunday. The tavern has since been closed and a criminal case opened against the owner, where police have concluded the investigation at the crime scene, but the cause of death is yet to be determined. A mass funeral will be held on Wednesday. Perhaps for more, SABC News reporter Lubabalo Tata is covering the story and gives us a live for more. A very good afternoon to you, Lubabalo. Thank you for joining us here. Let's look at what's emerging today. It's a week on since the tragedy. I believe that there was a prayer meeting was scheduled. It's been postponed. Just walk us through the reasons, perhaps what the latest is ahead of the funeral this week.
Well, a very good afternoon to you and the viewers at home. Today marks exactly a week since the tragic death of 21 people at Enyobeni Tavern. What I can tell you is that the wound is still far from healing. The families are still processing their loss. Today, there was supposed to be a prayer meeting that was organized by the Methodist Church of South Africa here at Scenery Park for the survivors of that tragedy. Unfortunately, that did not happen because upon consultation with the social workers, the congregants were told that the young people are still vulnerable, they are still grieving, and they are not ready to face the public. As a result, that had to be cancelled. But in the near future, there is a planned counselling that will be taking place with various stakeholders, talking to the families of the deceased as well as the survivors, including the parents of the deceased. This is a very, very difficult situation, and even for the community as well. They are still asking themselves questions. And with me, I am joined by one of the activists, Samkela Chobela, to talk to us more about the current situation here. So it's been a week, and I understand that the community as well is still puzzled by what has happened. You want answers, and you knew some of those people that unfortunately died at Enyobeni last week on Sunday. This must also be disturbing as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's very disturbing, but it's still very fresh. We are still puzzled, man. We are still left confused because there are no answers as to what has prevailed in that place of tragedy. We are still left confused. That's why we took a march on Friday to go to these various authorities and institutions on how they can answer us in terms of their own investigations and to tell us what were their findings as to what had happened there. And obviously, as this has been declared as a national crisis, we were expecting a bit of some speed up in the processes, but yet there is nothing, no engagement with the community as the youth, no engagement with everything that is happening. And all we see is that the kids, the survivors and the families are being put back into that traumatic process again and again by being engaged, by being asked the same questions by the media, by the authorities and by the local members of the community, and no one is coming with any solutions or any answers as to what has happened so that the kids can find a bit of some closure into what has happened.
Yes, I remember during the march, you said, the youth, in fact, of this area said that it's very disappointed with the way the police handled this matter, saying that they responded very late, and also about the investigation itself, saying that they're taking too long. But they said that they want to do a thorough investigation, hence they request more time and asking for patience on the side of the community as well as the nation as well.
It's been preached to us every day, to every incident that has happened there previously, even before this tragedy. They've been telling us they are doing thorough investigation and no resolutions have been made yet. And now we are here talking about 21 kids. You can imagine, 21 kids died, and if they did a bit of speed up and they did their job thoroughly, as they say they are doing right now, prior to this incident, I think some of these issues would have been prevented. There's a bit of, there's a lack of I don't know, lack of responsibility and lack of urgency amongst the stakeholders that are working within the communities.
Well, it seems as if underage drinking is something that has been promoted there at that establishment. We've heard that it was not the first incident that young people were sold alcohol in that establishment.
Yeah, we always, some things, when you let the rules and regulations slide a bit from one place, it happens to the next place, and it expands to other places, to more places like that one. Now, if the authorities, maybe like the liquor board, did their own follow-up as to after issuing the licenses, maybe some of these things wouldn't happen. Maybe the underage drinking wouldn't exist in our communities, but they lack that responsibility of follow-up, doing their own job, and we don't know what are their criteria of doing their job, because we can't do their job for them. They are the one that authorize the licenses and so forth. So it has become a bit of a norm because there's a lack of responsibility within the structures that are working within our communities.
All right, what do you propose as a solution to curb the underage drinking in communities?
Let's occupy the kids with activities. First of all, our soccer field, we were unable to use it because of the way that infrastructure is. It has not been taken care of. If they did this cleaning that they are doing right now, prior to this burial of 21 kids, if they did that every year, so that we can have a soccer field, we can have a netball field, we can have a whatever activity that the kids, that the youth wants to do, I think some of these things would be prevented, to keep them occupied, so that they do not have time to go to attend taverns. Because you can imagine a 13-year-old attending a tavern, but if you had a program up front to keep them occupied, maybe reading, maybe poetry, maybe anything to keep them within their likes, it would have been prevented into these programs. So I think there's a lack of responsibility amongst the leadership of this community, and there's a lack of engagement with the youth, because some of the programs that they bring within our community, they just assume that we want these programs, but it is always viable to first engage the kids as to what do they want. What do they want to be active in? Like the programs of sport, you see many kids are kicking a ball on the car road, and that is dangerous. But if we had soccer fields, that they would have had a place to be active in.
Well, I do understand that some of the community members have been calling for the permanent closure of that establishment. Is that what the youth also is saying?
Yes, that's what we would love, because less of those kind of establishments means less of that kind of indoctrination in the minds of the youth that is still growing, because we as the elderly youth, we believe that we have been failed by our predecessors, and now we don't want to become like our predecessors and fail our youth that is still growing, that still needs to see idols who are doing good within the communities, who are interacting in community development. So we need to close that place and find a solution into those kind of things.
Well, thank you very much, sir, for your time. Well, indeed, this afternoon we will get an update from the provincial government regarding the preparations for the funeral that is scheduled for Wednesday. There is still no word from the police regarding the cause of death. With that, it is back to you in studio.
All right, thank you very much, Lubabalo Dada. Again, our reporter giving us the latest. This comes as preparations are underway for the mass funeral for the Enyobeni Tavern victims. Again, SABC News reporter out in East London. That funeral is set to take place on Wednesday this coming week. In other news now, this week will also mark a year since the July unrest of 2021 in KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng. Over 300 people lost their lives during the unrest. The widespread riots are believed to have been sparked by the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma, but police also lifted the lid on the racial tensions and alleged racial killings that flared up in Phoenix, north of Durban, where over 30 people were killed during the racial tensions that erupted during the unrest in the area. Now, this then also followed President Cyril Ramaphosa appearing before the South African Human Rights Commission on the 1st of April 2022, where Ramaphosa said the violence and looting that swept through parts of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal costed the country 50 billion rand, whilst almost 2 million jobs were lost. Perhaps for more on this, as we reflect 1 year on, we are joined by KwaZulu-Natal Premier Sihle Zikalala. A very good afternoon to you, Premier. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC.
Yes, good afternoon to you and the viewers, and thanks for having us in your program.
It's obviously a touchy subject, emotional subject, perhaps as we look and reflect a year on. I mean, there are some harsh lessons, but also triumphs to reflect on as we navigate the road ahead. And I wonder if you could, begin by telling us, where were you when you heard of the unfolding of the unrest? What were some of your immediate responses as you reflect back a year on?
Yes, it will be remembered that this was propelled through, or it was coordinated and mobilized through social media. And therefore, we were here in the province when we got this news. We started ensuring that we engage with the community and the public in general to discourage any form of mobilization and destruction of property. So we worked throughout that period. The fact that it's a year now since those events, indeed, it brings back such memories where a number of people were killed, especially in areas such as Phoenix, Chatsworth, and Northdale in Pietermaritzburg. And that find some sentiment of racial tension and continues to implore on us to work hard on social cohesion and building a truly non-racial and integrated communities, which is the work that is under construction, and we will continue to do all efforts that are aimed at healing our nation and address racial intolerance.
Well, Premier, let's look at what those measures look like. You speak about healing, but we also, have to look at race and perhaps the issues of how these social constructs have been put together in place, and perhaps the measures that government have put in place to ensure that something like this does not occur in the country again. Are you satisfied with what's been achieved a year later?
No, we are not yet satisfied, but I can say we are progressing with the work. We are working hard to reconstruct the economy. Number of factories were destroyed, number of warehouses were destroyed and vandalized. So we're working hard on rebuilding. We are satisfied by the fact that SASTRIA has paid a number of businesses that were affected. And those businesses are beginning to open up and getting back into operation. That is satisfying us. But according to the report from the Human Rights Commission, which is the public knowledge, some of the things that exacerbated the situation is the whole issue of poverty and unemployment. And there is a need to focus our attention on addressing those two major causal factors of social instability.
Yeah, absolutely. We're speaking about addressing those triple threats of poverty, unemployment and inequality and creating that inclusive society as enshrined in our constitution, perhaps 28 years into our democracy. And you spoke about the South African Human Rights Commission. Let's get into that. There was an inquiry done by the SAHRC on the matter. And to date, we're still waiting to see, people being brought to book, being held accountable. What's the likelihood of the nation fully getting to the bottom of this as we still await justice? I mean, this definitely speaks to the issue of accountability and leadership.
Indeed, it talks to the accountability and leadership. And I believe that through the president, there was an inquiry on the whole issue of the state organs, whether the state organs responded effectively, the whole issue around the intelligence services, but also to ensure that investigation is taken forward and those who are behind are prosecuted. And then we believe that that process will once happen, and it will yield a result, because it should send a message that anyone who orchestrates such things has no place in our society. We have seen some individuals getting prosecuted, which is correct, but those are prosecuted for looting. And we believe that the focus also needs to go to those who instigated and coordinated this riot.
Well, Premier, we also have to reimagine the road ahead. And on the back of what President Cyril Ramaphosa echoed as he testified at the inquiry into this matter, mentioning how the unrest was nothing less than a deliberate, coordinated and well-planned attack on the democracy intended to cripple the economy and cause social instability at large, perhaps also weaken, the democracy in South Africa. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, as we begin to reimagine the way forward, we saw that the need for the diversification of resources and capital accumulation has also come to the fore. As we look at those reforms needed, what are you as the province to date doing to reimagine what this is going to look like as we mitigate against some of those triple threats as well?
We have put in place a program, a radical socio-economic transformation program. It aims to focus in various pillars. The first pillar is that of Black industrialists, supporting Blacks in general and Africans in particular to enter the space of industrialization. And that will help us to ensure that you get more people employed, but you get a distribution of the economy into all people, because you cannot undermine the fact that the racial tensions are always perpetuated by economic inequality. So the program we've put in place, the first area, as I've said, it's Black industrialists. But secondly, we've put in place a program of Operation Vula, where we set aside certain commodities as government, which are sourced through the dedicated process where we buy from Africans and Blacks manufacturers. And we need to be clear here, we are focusing on those who are manufacturing, whether it's agriculture or it's clothing and textile or any other. We're focusing on those who are manufacturing, and in doing so, we would want to spread those economic opportunities throughout KwaZulu-Natal so that there will be a balanced economic growth and distribution.
Well, you're definitely speaking about some of the more short-term measures, but we're also looking at the long-term objectives and policy changes that is obviously also imperative. Again, 2 million people having lost their jobs due to this unrest, already in a struggling economy. Premier, I can't ignore the fact that the province was also hit by the recent floods, and this has obviously increased the issue of unemployment and psychosocial trauma, but also, the lived experiences of those in the province. And I wonder what government has done to correct this for those directly impacted. How do we begin to measure those costs?
The cost is huge. It will take time to correct and address it. Look, it was from the era of COVID-19 where we had lockdown. A number of people who had not been working, and some had even lost jobs. Then we had this unrest. And thereafter, we have suffered the floods. So the stress and the emotional feelings amongst the people is, of course, impacted on by these incidents. But having said that, there is work that is being done in a short term, which I've presented, but in a long term also, there are plans of ensuring that we build a strong economy based on growing all sectors of the economy. But we also work on social integration through promotion of sports, arts and culture. It's a work that we have also started. So we are looking futuristically, and we believe that we should start now, don't waste time, start now, have short-term intervention, but also build and implement long-term interventions.
All right, Premier, in conclusion, we've obviously, to move ahead and to understand the contemporary lived reality, we have to reflect on what's probably happened so that we can learn in hindsight. And I wonder, you've spoken about leadership, you've spoken about accountability, you've spoken about some of these long-term objectives. In your personal opinion, what are some of the lessons that we have learnt from this as we navigate the road ahead for South Africa at large?
I think some of the lessons, firstly, will be to try and ensure that all structures work together. We must learn to appreciate that the political decisions have far-reaching consequences, but also the judicial process has its own implications. It must always be seen to be fair, transparent, and just. And we must also understand that what is obtaining at a high level is not really sometimes expressed at a ground level where you've got people living. And the attachment of people to certain individuals and leaders, if it's in it coincides with an environment that is fertile, could lead to such situations. In this case, maybe to make this point clearer, you had the arrest of the former president, but it came at a time when people were affected by high level of unemployment and poverty. And therefore the two merged. What started as a protest moved and escalated to take a form of a mobilization that was unguided and destructive in nature. And therefore, we should always try to address societal issues as quick as possible.
All right, Premier Sihle Zikalala, we're going to leave the conversation there. I want to thank you very much for your time here on the SABC. Again, this year marking a year since, this month rather, marking a year since the July unrest unfolded in the country. Again, hitting parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. Again, KZN Premier Sihle Zikalala giving us an update. This is the province reflects a year on after that unrest, where we understand over 300 people having lost their lives during that unrest. Again, quantifying the costs to date, South Africa's economy having lost about 50 billion rand, as we await justice for that matter as well. But we'll leave the conversation there and continue with other news now at this hour, where we've seen the Office of the Public Protector has assured South Africans that the investigations into President Cyril Ramaphosa with regards to allegations related to the 2020 robbery at his Palapala farm are well on track. It comes after Acting Public Protector Goleka granted the president an extension to respond to these allegations against him, which were due by the 22nd of June. Political parties have had some mixed views about this delay.
As a complainant in the matter, we should have been informed as ATM, and we should have been given reasons for that extension. And the time frame, the new time frame that the president must answer questions.
It must be noted that requests such as the president's are quite common where the Public Protector South Africa's investigative work is concerned. In fact, the President made a similar request in respect of a previous Executive Members Ethics Act investigation, that is the Bosasa matter, and that request was also acceded to. Decisions to accede to such requests are always informed by a careful consideration of the reasons advanced by the respondents, the need on the part of the Public Protector South Africa to be fair to respondents, and the amount of information requested from the respondents.
The economic freedom fighters views the delay of Cyril Ramaphosa to respond to 31 questions posed by the Public Protector Busia Mkhwebane to him as nothing but a delaying tactic and avoiding of public accountability, which is characteristic of this regime. Ramaphosa, who was involved in money laundering, kidnapping, bribery, and concealing a crime and defeating the ends of justice, is not busy with anything of material significance. And in fact, it is ironic that someone who's saying he can't respond to basic 31 questions within the set timeline was busy in private income-generating affairs on his Ankole farm, where he declared that being the president of South Africa is nothing but a side hustle.
We are calling on the president to do the honorable thing and step aside so that he can be able to deal with these matters. Clearly, the president is too busy to attend to some of the issues.
We must at all times respect the constitutional rights of every citizen in this country. Whether you are a president of the country or an ordinary citizen.
Well, Parliament has 24 months to amend the Marriage and the Divorce Acts or pass a legislation that would recognise Muslim marriages. This is according to the Constitutional Court, which declared the two pieces of legislation unconstitutional because they exclude Muslim marriages. The Divorce Act fails to make provision for the redistribution of assets when a Muslim marriage is dissolved. The Apex Court found that the Act fails to provide mechanisms to safeguard the welfare of minor children born of Muslim marriages in the same manner as those born of other marriages that are dissolved.
The court challenge on the rights of women in Muslim marriages was led by a women advocacy group. It took about 8 years to come to a landmark judgment.
We argued that it should apply retrospectively to 1994. However, the court indicated that it will only be by the 15th of December, so 2014, which is the date that we launched the case. What does this mean for women? It means that talaqs or divorces that have not yet gone through, proceedings that have not yet been finalized by the 15th of December 2014 moving forward, can bring those matters in terms of the Divorce Act. And then in addition to that, the nature of the divorce is out of community of property, which might remain a challenge for many women. However, there is a provision, 7.3 in the Divorce Act that can be used to ensure there's maintenance, in particularly post-divorce maintenance beyond the nafka 3-month period. In addition to that, equitable redress of the assets.
Samai says the judgment also brings relief for children and women in polygamous marriages.
When it comes to polygamous marriages, the order takes into account the rights of polygynous wives and speaks to the equitable redress, and have to take into account any contracts or agreements between the parties at the time. In addition to that, it also looks at the best interest of the child, because we do know that because marriages weren't treated like civil marriages, the family advocate did not automatically do a report in relation to what is in the best interest of the child. This is now automatic because the family advocate is now obliged to do that particular report and will now be speaking to custody and contact of care of children.
The Legal Women's Centre says there should be no delay in rectifying legislation that would recognize Muslim marriages.
It is important that civil society organizations also now keep women's rights organizations keep government accountable to ensure that it's done within 24 months, and in particularly before the next parliament or even the next transition. We need to ensure that this government is accountable for this particular matter, and to be able to ensure that there is a broad legislative process that remedies what the court indicated is unconstitutional.
A legal practitioner, Feiruz Nagia, who says she was a victim of abuse in a Muslim marriage, shares her ordeal.
I was involved in a very abusive physical relationship in my marriage. I had seen a local imam. At that point, I met with him. I basically gave him an affidavit to explain what had taken place. He read the affidavit and I came to him, and he had one call with this gentleman who got his sympathy by saying, she's a very beautiful woman and I understand, that you will want to listen to her and all of these things. And it's almost as if the imam totally shut down, did not listen to what I had to say any further, because he had such sympathy for this man. If I had not, as I said, gotten assistance elsewhere, I would have probably still been in a very abusive relationship, marriage, if not dead. So I think it's important that members of the ulama are aware of these things and that they come to the party in ensuring that women's rights are going to be enforced, and they're going to be dragged to the party whether they like it or not.
Nagia welcomed the Concord judgment with caution.
I think that it is really great, and it's a movement in the right direction to recognize Islamic marriages. One of the issues that we brought up back then was how to recognize this, what is the way, because essentially we are still going to have to go through two processes. We are still, as Muslim women, we are still facing a dual process here. So it's not just a matter of, being able to get our divorces immediately through the courts. That's not going to be the case. So for me, the question is, did the court go far enough to actually recognize the Islamic system that's associated to Muslim marriages? And I don't think they did. I think that there are bodies of law and there's rights and obligations which will not necessarily be enforceable because it's now boxed within a civil framework in terms of the Muslim marriages and in terms of the Divorce Act. Whereas Islamically, there are other areas as well that would apply that will not have or will not be brought to the forum of the court. So for Muslim women, that might be a bit difficult. It might be a bit complicated to understand even the fact that you still need to get your talaq, you still need to go through your marriage process as well. So it's almost as if it's an additional process now that you'll need to go through in order to realize rights. What I think is excellent is those provisions which provide parity and social justice, which are now enforceable in court.
Another legal practitioner and expert says while the judgment is welcomed, it does not deal specifically with Sharia law.
I studied the judgment as handed down by the Constitutional Court, and I found it to be long overdue simply because women and children are often the victims of discriminatory practices in our South African law. And therefore, particularly in the eyes of our courts, the finding of the Constitutional Court is extremely significant and long overdue. The most important factor is that the Constitutional Court at paragraph 63 onwards makes it very clear that this judgment is not engaging in what is known as doctrinal entanglement. In other words, not to get involved in religion. That this judgment is not about the Sharia. It's got nothing to do with the Sharia. It's got to do with the fact that children and women are often being the victims of abuse, discriminatory abuse that is taking place in Muslim marriages and divorces. And as a result of that, in the interests of women and children, which South Africa is a signatory of, this judgment stands. So in other words, they made it very clear that this is not a judgment on Sharia, it's a judgment on the fact that the Divorce Act and the Marriage Act were not consonant with Islamic practices, and therefore it was brought into line.
Al-Jama, one of the political parties in parliament, which has been advocating for the rights of Muslim communities, says an interim relief is needed to give effect to the judgment.
The appeal court also gave government 2 years. The High Court also gave government 2 years. So government had 6 years to amend the Divorce Act or amend the Marriage Act so that the nikah can be recognized and the talaq can be recognized. And now they've got another 2 years, so we've got to wait till 2024, and then only the 7th Parliament or the 8th Parliament will have the legislation in place. So now Al-Jamaa is saying that we need an interim arrangement, and that's why we submitted a private member's bill just to register a Muslim marriage so that it can have legal consequences. So when the imam marries you, it must trigger a certificate, a valid marriage certificate, a valid South African marriage certificate, which will give women and children legal consequences.
The Muslim Judicial Council says it will abide by the Concord judgment.
The MJC legal desk has deliberated concerning the judgment, and as far as the main relief is concerned, we are in support of it, and we definitely believe that it is a step forward in the right direction, as we would want to engage with government concerning within the next 24 months in either enacting new legislation that governs marriages concluded in terms of Islamic law as well as its consequences, or with regard to amending existing legislation that will recognize Islamic law marriages and also the consequences that flow therefrom. However, we would want it to be in terms of Islamic law as well. As far as the interim relief is concerned, we also basically are okay with it as far as dealing with marriages and the consequences there are for the duration of the next 24 months. However, whenever a couple would like to make use of the interim relief as per the judgment, I would advise, and the MJC would advise, that they just also consult an Islamic law scholar in that regard.
Meanwhile, the Department of Home Affairs is weighing up various options to regulate marriages in the country. Mercedes Basend, SABC News, Parliament.
Well, that's where we're going to leave the show today. Thank you very much for tuning in. From myself, Liesl Wilson, and the team, until next week, do stay safe and blessed. We'll see you soon. Goodbye for now.